thank you so much for joining me at my eccentric academy. Tonight, we are going to talk about something very interesting. Tonight, we are going to discuss fairies. Hello there. Welcome to class. My name is Cademan David, or as my skeleton butler calls me, Mr. Cow. Now this video is part of a series I have, where I'm world building a world for me to write stories and make cartoons in. And in it I discuss my version of fairies. So if that seems interesting to you, by all means, keep watching. So perhaps you might remember, in my last video where I talked about the creation of my world, I discussed a creator being named Eden. And I sort of roughly touched on the fact that this Eden character created both fairies and elves. So today we're going to talk about the fairies that she created. Now, if we're gonna talk about fairies, we have to first bring up which type of fairies, because in this world there is a lot of different kinds of fairies. You see, the world I'm building is based off of fairy tales and legends, and having a number of different types of fairies allows me the freedom to stay consistent with the way fairies are presented differently in different myths and legends. You see, fairies, they have something of a hierarchy. And the older you get as a fairy, the higher up on that hierarchy you go. Now, to explain all of the different types of fairies, I'm going to start at the very top of that hierarchy and work my way down. At the very top, we have Eden, who, of course, is not a fairy herself, but is the creator of fairies. The fairies were, of course, her favorite creation and the people that she was the most involved with. Now, just under Eden, we have the first fairies ever created. They were called the Aurelia. These are the oldest fairies, being the very first ones that were created by Eden. These are also the fairies that are the queens and rulers of the many fairy kingdoms. These fairies are ancient wise women, as old as the stars themselves. Now, the Aurelia mostly stay in the realm of Elfhaven and don't get involved with the other realms or other creatures. But that much can't be as stated for our next level down of fairies. Now, the Gwynseri are nowhere near as old as the Aurelia, but many of them are still very old, most being alive for the second and third interdimensional wars, and some even being alive for the first one. Now, these fairies are high up and well respected in the Elfhaven fairy forests, but unlike the Aurelia, they're also more likely to get involved in outside affairs, many of these fairies becoming guardians for other species or being adopted into human kingdoms. Now, it's these fairies that represent guardian angels and or fairy godmothers in stories like Cinderella or the original Beauty and the Beast story. These fairies aren't just wise women, but they're warriors. Think Jedis mixed with nuns mixed with Mary Poppins. That's what the Gwynseri are. Next down, we have the Thistral. The Thistral are very similar to the Gwynseri in a lot of ways. However, they're a little bit younger and a little bit lower down on the fairy hierarchy. These fairies still resemble warrior Jedi nuns, but the main difference is that they take their orders from the Gwynseri. Next down, we have the Rosathorn. The Rosathorn are slightly smaller. Every fairy we've discussed this far stands at the height of a normal human woman, until we get to the Rosathorn, which stand at the height of shorter human women. The Rosathorn is a term for fairies that become old enough that they start their training to become a thistral. Oftentimes this will be a apprentice-type relationship with a thistral master. Think a Jedi and a Padawan. That's sort of a similar relationship that the fairies have. Now, the next layer down of fairies we have the moss hands. The moss hands are sort of the common folk of fairies. The moss hands do the gardening and taking care of the land, including harvesting moss, which is where they get their names from. You can think of these particular fairies as being something like garden gnomes, just sort of hanging out and working nature. That's what these fairies are. Now, the moss hands stand around 4 or 5 feet tall, and there's not much to say about them besides that they're just sort of common folk. They live in the forest and take care of it, but also are servants of the older, higher ranks of fairies. The next layer down we have Brandican, which stand at 2 to 4 feet tall. Brandican tend to have a more mischievous edge to them, being a little bit more of tricksters and a little bit more jokey. At the end of the day, Brandican, being such young fairies, they tend to have a lot more playfulness to them. But it's not all fun and games. Of course, the Brandican also do a lot of forest upkeep as well as the other duties of the moss hand. They just have more time to play. And if you ever hear about a fairy playing pranks on a human or something like that, it is probably a Brandican that is doing that. So in a number of different fairy tales, we actually see sort of fairies that will play tricks, as well as fairies that are sort of mischievously helpful. A lot of times they might also be called elves, like the elves in the Shoemaker. That's sort of what these guys represent. This is sort of what I have these guys for. Next, we have Luminette. So I recently read the original Peter Pan book, and the way fairies like Tinkerbell are sort of described in this world is so interesting to me. I just had to do something similar with my fairies as well, so that's what the Luminettes are. Luminettes, at their biggest, are 1 foot tall, and at their smallest, stand at 10 inches. So they start out very, very small. And this is probably the fairy that you might think of when you think of a fairy. Thinking of Tinkerbell from the original Peter Pan stories, she is a Luminette. And that's the kind of fairies that Luminettes are. They tend to be very playful, very emotional, and not good at managing their emotions. But they're also very crafty, many of them picking up different sort of creative trades. I was actually somewhat surprised reading the Peter Pan book that Tinkerbell, being a fairy that fixes pots and pans, was actually in the original text and not just a creation of Disney. But since it is in the original book, I feel inclined to keep it, saying that these type of fairies are something of craftsmen, and many of them have different creative trades, Tinkerbell being, of course, a tinker, hence the name. Now, there is 1 or 2, depending on how you count it, classes of fairies that are even younger and even smaller than the Luminettes, and that is the Weavers. You see, before fairies resemble humans in any way, they first look like a spider. But just because they resemble a spider doesn't mean they behave exactly as a spider would. So something of where the idea for the Weavers came from is I sort of realized that in fantasy there's a lot of like evil giant spiders and stuff like that. And it's understandable why. After all, spiders, they eat their mates after mating. which is kind of gross and weird. But also I think spiders are artists, right? Spiders represent artistry because they make beautiful spider webs. So I wanted to just create a fantasy good magical spider, and that's what the weavers are, is they represent artistry and creativity. You see, even in the arachnid state, before fairies learn any sort of communication, you can still see their personality in the way they choose to weave their webs, and how friendly they may or may not be to other races. Now, when a weaver reaches a certain age, it weaves itself a cocoon of webs, and it is in that cocoon that the weaver begins to develop into a Lumiette. But where does the weaver come from? The weaver comes from fairy eggs, which are called Schnuggleshrums. So in conclusion, the sort of fairy development looks something like this, starting with Schnuggleshrums all the way to Aurelia. Now, that's all I have to share about fairies, but I plan to make more videos in the future delving into the culture of my fairies and perhaps more of the philosophy as well. But if you liked this video, of course hit the like button, and if you want to hear about how this world was created in the first place, I will link that video right up there so you can click on it. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember to brush your teeth. Hygiene is important.